The woman moved like someone who had already been turned away twice that morning and was deciding whether a third attempt was worth the humiliation. That was the first thing Hattie Drummond noticed from the kitchen window of the Clearwater Ranch. Not the stranger's coat, though it was wrong for the weather, too thin for the Alberta foothills in late October, not even her boots, though they told a story of their own, cracked along the left sole and held together with what appeared to be a strip of harness leather and sheer stubbornness. It was the walk, deliberate, measured, the walk of someone who has learned to spend nothing they don't have to spend, including hope. Hattie was 71 years old and had been watching people come up that gravel road for 46 of those years. She knew the difference between someone who wanted something and someone who needed something. This woman wanted nothing. She needed everything. Behind Hattie, her husband Roy sat at the kitchen table with the account ledger open and the look on his face he always wore when the numbers were talking, and he didn't like what they were saying, which lately was every morning. "Someone coming up the road," Hattie said. Roy didn't look up. "Ryder?" "Walker." That made him look up. They had built the Clearwater from raw land and a borrowed team of horses, Roy and Hattie Drummond, 46 years of fence posts and hard winters, and one creek that flooded every third spring without fail and flooded anyway when it felt like it. 420 acres of foothill grassland along the eastern slope of the Rockies, east of Pincher Creek, where the wind came off the mountains in November, with a particular personal meanness that Hattie had never entirely forgiven it for. They ran 70 head of beef cattle and had once, in better years, run 110. They had raised 3 children here. 2 of them were grown and gone in the ordinary way of things, Patrice in Lethbridge, Michael in Calgary, both busy with their own lives and their own troubles. The third was buried on the hillside above the horse pasture, taken by an accident on the road to Waterton when he was 26, and that was a wound Hattie carried quietly and would carry until she didn't carry anything anymore. They were too old to run this place alone. That was not a feeling. That was a fact written in Roy's body every morning when he got out of bed, and in Hattie's knees every time she climbed the pasture fence, and in the account ledger that Roy stared at with the expression of a man reading a letter from someone he used to trust. The woman reached the gate and stopped. She was younger than Hattie had expected from the walk. Late 20s, maybe 30, it was hard to say. Dark hair pulled back in a practical knot. A face that had been weathered by something other than sun, though there was some of that too. She stood at the gate and looked at the ranch the way a person looks at a problem they are trying to solve before they speak, taking in the barn, the cattle visible in the far field, the leaning post on the east fence that Roy had been meaning to reset since August. Then she walked to the door and knocked. Hattie opened it before Roy could say not to. "Ma'am." The woman held her hat, a battered canvas thing, in both hands. Up close, she was solidly built, the kind of strong that comes from actual work rather than effort. There was a tiredness in her face that was not weakness, more the look of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has learned to carry it well. Her eyes were dark and clear and took in the house behind Hattie with a single careful glance before returning to her face. Not calculating, just attentive, the way competent people are attentive. "I'm sorry to bother you. I've been walking since first light from the highway cutoff." She paused. "I can see from your gate that your east pasture fence has a post heeling over, and you've got 2 strands of wire gone slack on the north corner. And your hay shelter." She glanced toward the barn. "The tarpaulin on the east side is lifting. You'll lose feed in the next wind." She looked back at Hattie. "I know cattle, I know fence and water, and I know horses. I've been working ranches since I was 17. If you'll let me stay, I'll work for room and board. That's all I'm asking." Hattie looked at her. "In exchange for what?" Hattie asked. "I just said room and board." From behind her came the sound of Roy pushing back his chair. He came to the door and stood beside Hattie, and the young woman's posture shifted. Not fearful, just more careful, the way it does when the person who makes the decisions enters the room. Roy Drummond was a tall man who had been taller, the years having compressed him slightly the way years do to men who have spent them bending toward hard work. He had large, scarred hands and a face like a topographic map of the last 46 winters. He looked at the woman the way he looked at everything, slowly, without hurry, as though he had decided long ago that conclusions reached quickly were usually wrong. "Where are you from?" he said. "Saskatchewan originally. Kindersley, if that means anything to you." "Working or traveling?" A pause. "Working mostly, some of both." "What brings you to this part of Alberta?" Her jaw moved once, a small involuntary tightening. "I was working a place outside Fort Macleod. It didn't work out." Roy's eyes moved over her. The coat, the boots, the absence of any bag or pack, the particular quality of stillness in a person who has learned not to show too much. "What's your name?" Maren Kelso." Roy looked at Hattie. Hattie looked at Roy. 46 years of marriage had made this its own language. A full conversation conducted in 3 seconds of eye contact across a doorway. She saw the hesitation forming in him, the history of it, the drifter 2 summers ago, who had borrowed the truck on a Tuesday and never brought it back. The young man before, that who had turned out to have a temper he kept well hidden for exactly 11 days. The word no was assembling itself on Roy's lips with the quiet inevitability of long practice. And then the dog started barking from the direction of the hay barn, and it was not the bark that meant a coyote on the fence line or a vehicle on the road. It was the bark that meant something was wrong with the cattle, and both Roy and Hattie had been married to this land long enough to know the difference without thinking about it. Maren turned before either of them had moved. "You're Southgate," she said, already stepping off the porch, already reading the field the way someone reads a page they've read 100 times before. Something's pushed them into the corner. "You've got 3, maybe 4 minutes before they go through the wire." She looked back at Roy. "Do you have a horse or a quad?" Roy said, "Quad's in the lean-to." "Keys?" "In it." She was already moving. What followed was 20 minutes that Hattie would think about for a long time afterward. Maren Kelso took the quad across the south pasture at a speed that suggested complete comfort with the terrain she had never seen before in her life, read the panic in the cattle before it became a stampede, and worked the herd back from the corner fence with a combination of the quad, her own body on foot, and what appeared to be an almost preternatural patience, moving slowly when the animals needed slow, cutting fast when they needed fast, never once pushing hard enough to make things worse. The cattle dog, an ancient and opinionated blue heeler named Sargent, who had been Roy's dog for 9 years and had never in those 9 years shown particular enthusiasm for strangers, ran the flank with the focused energy of an animal who had found, unexpectedly, someone who actually knew what they were doing. Roy and Hattie stood at the fence and watched. Roy said after a while. Hattie said nothing. She was counting cattle. Maren brought them in through the gate, with all 70 head accounted for, latched the gate behind her, and drove the quad back to the lean-to. She climbed off and walked back to where they were standing. 3 places the wire is down along the south line, she said, and whatever spooked them came from the direction of that woodlot to the west. Could be a predator checking your herd. Could be someone on the other side of your property line who shouldn't be. I'd walk it this afternoon before dark. Roy looked at his cattle. He looked at the woman. He looked at Hattie. Hattie said, "There's a room above the tack shed. It's heated, but only just. There's a cot and a lamp and a hook on the door." Maren nodded once. "That's more than I had last night." "Supper's at 6. We don't hold it." "Yes, ma'am." Hattie watched her walk toward the tack shed to look at the room before committing to it, which was, Hattie thought, the behavior of a sensible person. She turned and walked back to the house. "I know," Roy said behind her. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. In the days that followed, Maren Kelso proved useful in the way that certain people are useful, not because they make a performance of effort, but because they understand the nature of a problem before they speak about it, and their hands are already moving before the conversation catches up. She reset the healing fence post on the east pasture and walked the entire perimeter after, marking weak points with orange flagging tape in a system she explained to Roy without being asked, which he understood immediately and appreciated without saying so out loud, which was how he appreciated most things. She fixed the tarpaulin on the hay shelter and, while she was up there, identified a rot in one of the purlins that would have caused a partial collapse by February. She pointed it out to Roy with no drama, described what would need to be done to fix it, and asked if she should proceed. He said yes, she did. She was good with the cattle. Not just technically good, there is a quality that is harder to describe, the ability to exist in a herd without disturbing it, to read the collective mood of 70 animals as though they share a language she happens to be fluent in. Roy watched her work the cattle one afternoon and didn't say anything, but Hattie saw his face and understood what it meant. Their son Colin had that same quality. She didn't let herself follow that thought further. Maren ate supper with them every evening at 6 and was never late. She was quiet at the table, not uncomfortable quiet, more the quality of someone who listens more than they speak and finds that arrangement suits them. She asked about the land, which low areas flooded in spring, what the grazing rotation was, which bulls they'd kept and which they'd sold off, and why. The questions of someone building knowledge for a purpose longer than tomorrow. Roy answered her a little more each evening. Hattie watched this and kept her own counsel. Because there was something about Maren Kelso that she couldn't quite place. Not a wrongness, nothing like that. Hattie had spent 71 years developing an instinct for dishonesty, and this woman had none of it. She worked without being observed. She never entered the house uninvited. She asked before she changed anything. She had, Hattie noticed, a habit of pausing before she spoke, as though she was choosing her words the way a careful person chooses footing on uncertain ground. It was something else. It was the way she never talked about where she'd been. Not evasively, not with the sharp deflections of someone hiding something serious, more the way a person doesn't discuss a wound that still requires them to be careful around it. Kindersley originally, working ranches since 17. 7 years compressed into a sentence. 7 years that had turned a Saskatchewan girl into someone walking along a highway in the wrong coat in October, with no bag and no phone, and the quiet, contained patience of a person who has stopped expecting things to be easy. One evening in early November, when the first real cold had come down off the mountains and they were sitting after supper with the wood stove going and the wind doing what the November wind always did, Hattie set down her mug and said, "Maren, what happened in Fort Macleod?" Roy looked up from his book. Maren was quiet for a moment, looking at the middle distance. Then she looked at the stove. "I was working for a family called Denner. Good people, I thought, or I wouldn't have stayed 2 seasons. I was managing their cattle operation. They had 120 head and a hay contract with 3 outfits in the area." She paused. The son came back from the city in the spring. He had ideas about how the ranch should be run. I disagreed with most of them. He was used to being agreed with. "And," Hattie said, "and he fired me, gave me a week's pay, and told me to be off the property by morning." She was quiet for a moment. "I was off the property in 2 hours. I didn't want to be somewhere I wasn't wanted." The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the spruce trees along the creek. "My phone went with a bag I left at the bunkhouse," she said. "I didn't go back for it." A pause. "I had $40 in my coat. The coat, as you've probably noticed, is not adequate." "No," Hattie said, "it isn't." She stood up and went to the closet in the hallway and came back with a heavy canvas barn coat, lined with a collar that could be turned up. She set it on the table in front of Maren without comment. Maren looked at it, then at Hattie. "I'll earn it." "I know you will. That's why I gave it." She had been trying not to finish the thought that had started when she watched Maren work the cattle, the one that kept surfacing and that she kept pressing back down. Colin, the way Maren moved in a herd, the questions she asked about land and water, and the logic of a good grazing rotation. The same questions, asked the same careful way, that Hattie's son had asked sitting at this same table, with his elbows on the same wood, looking at his father with the particular concentrated attention of a young person trying to learn everything before time runs out. She pressed the thought back down and went to wash the mugs. There was a man named Dale Purvis, who had been approaching Roy for the better part of 2 years about the Clearwater. He was from Red Deer, a property developer with fingers in several pies along the foothills corridor, a man who wore clean boots and spoke in the tone of someone who considers patience to be a negotiating strategy rather than a virtue. Roy had said no twice. The second time he'd said it across a fence with a posture that communicated, without any ambiguity, that the subject was closed. Purvis apparently did not consider subjects closed. He came on a Wednesday afternoon in November with a man Hattie didn't recognize and a folder of documents, and the comfortable inevitability of someone who believes that all resistance is eventually a matter of price. Roy was in the equipment shed. Hattie was in the house. Purvis knocked at the door and began speaking before Hattie had fully opened it. She said, "Mr. Purvis, I've told you what Roy's told you." "Mrs. Drummond, I just want 15 minutes. "Maren," Hattie said it without raising her voice, toward the barn. She wasn't sure Maren would hear. But a moment later, Maren appeared from the hay barn with Sargent at her heels, and she walked across the yard toward the house with the same unhurried directness she brought to everything. Not aggressive, just purposeful, the walk of a person who has assessed a situation and decided what to do about it. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Can I help you?" she said. Purvis looked at her the way he always looked at things he hadn't anticipated. "I'm here to speak with Roy Drummond." "Roy's not available right now. I can take a message." "And you are?" "Maren Kelso. I manage operations here." She said it without emphasis, without performance, the way you state a fact about the weather. "If you have business with Clearwater, you can speak with me." Purvis smiled the smile of a man accustomed to going around obstacles. "I have an offer for the property. A good one. This ranch is a lot of land for." "Clearwater isn't for sale." Maren's voice was even. "I think Roy's made that clear." "Circumstances change." Purvis gestured at the yard, the barn, the general weight of an aging operation. "This is a lot to manage. I'm offering a fair price and a clean exit. There's no shame in." "The Drummonds have been on this land for 46 years, Maren said. "I don't think you need to explain their situation to them." She looked at him steadily. "I'll let Roy know you came by. If you want to leave your contact information, I'll see he gets it." Purvis was quiet for a moment. The man beside him was very carefully looking at nothing. "I'd like to speak to Roy directly." "I know you would." Maren's tone hadn't changed at all. No edge in it, no heat. Just the patient firmness of someone who has decided exactly where the line is and is standing on it. "Roy's not available. I've said that. If you come back when Roy is available, you're welcome to try the conversation again. The answer will be the same." Something shifted in Purvis's expression. Not anger exactly. More the recalibration of a man who has been looking at a door he thought was open and has realized it is not. He looked past Maren at the house, where Hattie was standing in the doorway, and at the barn, where Roy had appeared and was leaning on the frame with his arms crossed and no visible expression. "This conversation isn't over," Purvis said. "Probably not," Maren said. "Come back in daylight next time and call first." Purvis and his companion got back in the truck and drove down the gravel road and turned onto the highway and were gone. Maren stood at the bottom of the porch steps until the sound of the truck faded out. Then she turned. Roy had come across the yard while she wasn't watching and was standing a few feet away, and he was looking at her with an expression that Hattie, in the doorway, had not seen on her husband's face in a very long time. It was the way he had looked at Colin. That evening, Roy did something he didn't do on ordinary evenings. He brought out the Canadian Club that lived in the back of the cabinet above the refrigerator, the bottle that appeared only for things that warranted the occasion, and he put 2 glasses on the table without asking. He pushed one toward Maren and sat down across from her. She looked at the glass, then at him. "You handled that right," Roy said. "He'll come back." "He will." Roy turned his glass in his hands. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man's assembling the right words in the right order. "I knew when I was standing at the barn that I wasn't going out there," he said finally, "because I'd have said something, and saying something to a man like that gives him ammunition." He looked at the table. "I know that, but knowing a thing and being able to do a thing are not always the same." Maren said nothing. "I'm 73 years old," Roy said, "and this ranch is everything I have, and I can't work it the way it needs working. Not anymore. Purvis knows that. That's what gives him his patience." He paused. "He can wait, and I can't." "He doesn't know about me yet," Maren said. Roy looked at her. "No." "Then we have some time before he recalibrates," she considered. "He'll come back with paperwork next time, and probably a lawyer. We should talk to someone in town before he does." Roy was quiet. He turned his glass. The fire moved in the wood stove, and the house held its warmth against the November outside, and Hattie, sitting in the corner with her mending, had stopped mending. "I lost someone," Roy said at last. "Who would have known what to do at that gate today?" Maren waited. "My son Colin, 5 years ago." Roy's voice didn't change. He had long practice. He knew this land the way. He started differently. He used to ask the same questions you ask, about the pasture rotation, which low fields to leave for spring. A silence. "I didn't know," Maren said. "No." Roy finished his whiskey, set the glass down, looked at her with the careful directness of a man who spent a long time deciding things and decided them thoroughly once he got there. "I want to make you an offer." Maren looked at him. "Work this place through the winter. In the spring, if it's still working, if you want to stay, I'll put something formal together. A labor contract to start, and if that holds, we talk about a partnership arrangement. Real ownership stake, not just wages." He paused. "I'm not going to live forever. This land needs someone who understands it." He looked at her steadily. "I think you might." The kitchen was very quiet. "Why?" Maren said. "Because you walked that perimeter without being asked," Roy said. "Because you didn't argue with me, you just showed me what needed doing and let me draw my own conclusions. Because you stood at those steps today and didn't get angry and didn't get clever, you just held the line." He paused. "And because Sargent likes you, he doesn't like anybody." Maren looked at her glass. Her jaw worked once. She did not look away. "I had a chance at something like this before," she said. "A place that was going to be mine. It didn't work out." "I know," Roy said. "You told us about Fort Macleod." "Before that." She was quiet for a moment. "There was a family in Manitoba. Good people. I worked for them 3 years, and they were going to take me on as a partner when the old man retired." She looked at her hands. "His daughter came back from the city with a fiancé and different plans, and I was given notice on a Friday afternoon." She looked up. "I'm not." She stopped. "I've learned to be careful about what I expect from people." "That's fair," Hattie said from the corner. Maren looked at her. "It's fair," Hattie said again, setting down her mending, "to be careful. But being careful isn't the same as being closed." She looked at the woman across the table, this particular stranger, who had walked up their road with cracked boots and a trained eye, and the patient self-sufficiency of someone who has had to be their own safety net for too long. "You've been moving a long time." "Yes." "Are you tired of it?" Maren was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the spruce trees. Sargent had settled on the mat by the wood stove with the boneless certainty of a dog who has decided this is where he belongs, which was, Hattie thought, as good an endorsement as she needed. "Yes," Maren said, "I'm tired of it." "Then stay," Hattie said, "and we'll figure out the rest as we go." Purvis came back in January, as Maren had said he would, with a lawyer from Lethbridge and a revised offer, and the tone of a man who has decided to be very reasonable as a prelude to being very firm. He found Maren at the gate with a copy of the registered partnership agreement that Roet's lawyer in Pincher Creek had filed with the county in December, and a letter from that same lawyer explaining what the agreement meant for any future approaches regarding the Clearwater Ranch. She handed him the letter without raising her voice. Purvis read it. He looked at Roy, who was standing at the barn with his arms crossed and 30 years of property ownership on his face. He looked at Maren. He said something short and turned his car around and drove back to wherever men like Dale Purvis go when they have run out of angle. He did not come back. The winter that followed was the kind that the Alberta foothills deliver when they want you to understand something about the nature of the country you have chosen. 3 weeks in January, when the temperature did not rise above -30, and the water lines needed checking twice daily, and the cattle required more attention and more feed than the original calculations had allowed for. And the mornings required a kind of negotiation between what needed doing and what the body at 73 years old was willing to agree to. Maren worked through it without complaint. Roy noticed this without mentioning it. The noticing and the not mentioning was how respect moved between them, and it turned out to be a language Maren understood and returned in kind. By March, when the first Chinook came through and the snow pulled back from the south pasture and the creek began talking under the last of the ice, something had settled at the Clearwater Ranch. It wasn't simple. Hattie still climbed the hill above the horse pasture some evenings and stood at Colin's grave marker and said things into the mountain air that were between her and her son alone. Grief doesn't leave. It changes the way everything changes, not into an absence, but into something that has learned to share the space with other things. There were other things now, the sound of the quad going out at first light. The sound of Sargent running the fence line with the self-importance of an animal who considers this role the appropriate use of his talents. The sound of Roy and Maren in the equipment shed in the evenings, talking through the spring calving plan. Roy explaining the quirks of the Clearwater's particular geography, Maren asking the right questions in the right order. Both of them sometimes stopping mid-sentence because they'd arrived at the same conclusion from different directions, and finding that more interesting than finishing the sentence. The sound of supper at 6 and the conversation that ranged longer now, across seasons and plans, and the slow accumulation of a shared understanding of what this place needed and what it could give back. On the first warm day of April, Hattie found Maren sitting on the top rail of the south pasture fence in the late afternoon light, watching the cattle move through the new grass. Hattie climbed up beside her, which her knees registered as a formal complaint. They sat in silence for a while. "You wrote to someone," Hattie said. She'd seen the envelope on the hall table 2 days ago, addressed to a place in Lethbridge. Maren looked at the cattle. "My sister." "We haven't," she paused. "It's been a few years. I've been hard to find." "Did you tell her where you are?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "We'll see." Hattie looked out at the south fence line, straight and solid from one end to the other, every post set right, at the repaired hay shelter, at the cattle fat and calm in the good April light. "When Roy and I came here," she said, "we had $2,000 and a land title and a piece of paper with a hand-drawn map on it that turned out to be not quite accurate. First winter I was sure we'd made a mistake. Second winter I was certain of it." Maren looked at her. "But we had something," Hattie said. "A place that was ours, that needed us in a specific way no other place was going to need us. That's different from just having somewhere to sleep." She looked at the woman beside her. Having somewhere that needs you, that's what changes a person, Maren. Not having it, losing it, is what makes you walk the way you walked up our road in October. Maren was quiet for a long moment. Below them, Sargent completed a circuit of the pasture with great dignity and returned to sit at the base of the fence post directly beneath them, looking up at them both with the calm authority of a dog who has decided the situation is well in hand. "I know," Maren said. She did know. Had known it, if she was honest, since the morning in November, when she had walked the perimeter fence with the flagging tape and realized that she was not marking problems. She was learning the language of the land, the way you learn the language of a place you intend to stay. She had known it the way you know some things, not all at once, and not by deciding, but by noticing one morning that the drifting had stopped and that the stopping felt like arriving. I keep thinking about the coat. Hattie didn't ask Maren to earn it first. She didn't set conditions or explain her reasoning. She just went to the closet, came back and put it on the table, and Maren, who had spent years learning not to expect things from people, looked at that coat and said, "I'll earn it." Not because she had to, because that's who she was. That moment stays with me more than the dramatic ones, more than the confrontation with Purvis at the gate, more than the partnership agreement filed with the county, because it tells you everything about why the story ends the way it does. Maren didn't receive trust because she asked for it. She received it because she had already been living as though it mattered, quietly, in every small thing she did when no one was watching. The fence she walked without being asked. The hay shelter rot she flagged without making it a negotiation. The way she stood at those porch steps and held the line without anger and without theater, just steady, because she had decided that was what the situation required. That's the thing about integrity, the real kind, not the performed kind. It doesn't wait for an audience. Maren fixed that fence post in the cold on a Tuesday morning not because Roy was watching, but because a loose fence post is a problem, and she was the person who could fix it. That's it. And Roy noticed. Of course he noticed. People like Roy always notice, even when they don't say so. I think about the years before that Tuesday, too. 2 seasons in Fort Macleod, working honestly for a family she respected, and then a Friday afternoon notice because someone's son came back from the city with different plans. 3 years in Manitoba, same story, different chapter. That kind of thing doesn't just sting, it reshapes you. It teaches you to hold back, to hedge, to protect what's left of your willingness to invest in a place. And yet Maren walked that perimeter with flagging tape on her second day. She was already learning the land before she had any guarantee the land would be hers. That's not naivety. That's a particular kind of intelligence, the understanding that the way you do the work is inseparable from the outcome of the work. She couldn't control whether Roy and Hattie would keep her. She could control whether she showed up as someone worth keeping. And then there's the letter to her sister. That one line in the story that could be easy to pass over. Maren, who had made herself hard to find for years, sat down and wrote a letter and put a return address on it. After everything, that takes something. A willingness to be found again, to be known again, after you've spent a long time being careful about exactly that. I think that's what Hattie meant when she said that having somewhere that needs you changes a person. Not just the work, the belonging. The way it gives you back a version of yourself you'd started to think was gone. Roy and Hattie didn't save Maren. Maren didn't save Roy and Hattie. What happened was more ordinary and more remarkable than that. 3 people, each carrying something heavy, found that they were more capable of carrying it together than alone. That's not a miracle. That's what happens when good character meets the right circumstance, and both parties have the patience to let it become something real. Sargent figured it out first, of course. He usually does.